Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Tuesday, February 17th. I am your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Jacob, thank you as ever for staying up so late to speak with me so early in Israel.
Happy to be with you, Amanda.
Always a pleasure. Today, we are going to discuss the talks that are set to commence in the afternoon between U.S. and Iran in Switzerland over Iran's nuclear program. We'll also learn about the upcoming Board of Peace meeting, the inaugural meeting that is set for Thursday this week in Washington, D.C. And finally, we'll discuss U.S. President Donald Trump's attacks on Israeli President Isaac Herzog. All of this and more when we're back.
ביחד. מההתחלה.
בשם השף נעשה ונצליח.
אתם הטבחים חושבים שאתם מחזיקים את העולם בביצים. זה לא טוב לך מה שאתה עושה. מה אתה יודע מה טוב לי, מה לא טוב לי? סרוויס! לא יוצאת לי מהראש. אתה שקרן. מה את רוצה ממני? חי.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Now, Jacob, the talks that are set to commence this afternoon in Geneva are surrounding sanctions more than anything on Iran, economic sanctions. And Iran is demanding the lifting of sanctions in order to basically come to the table and discuss the nuclear program. Israel, for its part, is in the wings. And of course, our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went to D.C. last week to set out Israel's requirements for Iran's nuclear program, which basically, in my reading of it, is that they don't have one. So, Jacob, what can you tell us before the talks commence today?
The gaps still seem quite wide between the sides. I think the only thing that shrinks them is just the notion that President Trump insists that Iran wants a deal, and that he's interested in trying to reach one rather than pursuing the military option as the U.S. moves the second aircraft carrier to the region. But still, we're talking about the same principles that Iran has not moved from regarding the demand that it be allowed to continue enriching uranium on its soil, that it basically continue to have a program, as you mentioned. And then, and it doesn't want to talk about proxies in the region that it's been funding or its ballistic missile program. While Iran is saying in the past 24 hours that it's willing to be flexible, it's not really saying on what issues specifically or offering a proposal. I think that's what the U.S., the top negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, last week during the first round of talks, talked about asking Iran to come with a real concrete proposal of a compromise that it was willing to offer at this second round in Geneva. So that will be the test. But for now, it doesn't really look like there's much to go off of for there to be a deal.
Right. And the idea of a strike is obviously still on the table. And we're hearing all sorts of different figures being thrown around in terms of when the deal has to be reached. And your President Donald Trump likes to throw around the 2-week mark, but we're not hearing anything concretely from his point of view. At the same time, we are seeing Iran committing or practicing drilling their military very overtly, and another very strong message to the U.S. Regarding this military measure. What are you hearing about any kind of military options still on the table?
Look, I think the U.S. is speaking in terms of weeks, not months. Lindsey Graham, who seems to be making visits to Israel every couple weeks, is in town again. And that's what he told Israeli media, that the U.S. doesn't want this to drag out, and that if things don't move in the direction it would like to see, that it is prepared to pursue the military option. I still think, though, it's unclear how much sway he does have with President Trump. I think he's seen in Israel as this Trump whisperer, but at the end of the day, I think Congress has a pretty limited ability to influence him, and I think at the White House, so that's where the decisions are being made. And I think they're trying to weigh whether or not there's going to be an actual impact of a strike. I think that was something that it was more enticing to Trump the first time around because we weren't talking about a potential of a drawn-out military conflict. There was an interesting report in the New York Times a couple days ago about that the U.S. is preparing for a possible weeks-long strikes and military operation against Iran, which does seem to be a little bit out of character for President Trump, who wants things to be done very quickly. But I think that's what they're trying to still figure out. If there is some sort of strike that can be conducted that doesn't drag the U.S. into a prolonged conflict.
Right. And in the meantime, of course, the economic sanctions on Iran are pretty crippling. The cost of living there has rocketed in the grade of hundreds of percentage points. And people there are really suffering just to, be able to buy their basic necessities. And this seems to be a tactic that Trump has used, throughout the world. Of course, I'm thinking about the tariffs. And in this case, it really actually seems to be bringing Iran to the table. So today we have set at the table, we're meant to see Steve Witkoff on the U.S. side, and on the Iranian side, the foreign minister. And what else can you tell us about, the atmosphere or any kind of direction that the talks may take with this idea of sanctions on the table?
I don't think the U.S. is inclined to lift them. I think that was actually one of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu discussed with President Trump last week, which is that we need to continue to hold Iran's feet to the fire, and including sanctioning on oil exports from China. As for what else we can expect, I think Iran likes to frame these talks as indirect, so they'll start with some sort of mediation. But I think Steve Witkoff and now Jared Kushner, who's joining him, are pretty adamant about meeting face-to-face with the Iranians, and that I think we're likely to see that, like last time. I think they were dubbed indirect, and then there was a one-on-one meeting, and I don't think was just a, hello, how are you? I think there was some substance that took place then. So I think that will be the format as well this time, where towards the end of the meeting, you'll have some direct contact between the sides.
Okay, and this is meant to be a 1 day of talks. Do you know anything about the timeline here, Jacob?
For now, it's just one meeting, and I assume if the U.S. feels like enough progress is made, they'll try to schedule another one in the coming days. But I think Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will be heading back to Washington later this week for this Board of Peace meeting that will be happening on Thursday.
Okay, so let's get to a short break, and then we'll discuss what we know about this upcoming Board of Peace meeting.
While Israeli reservists were serving, the financial reality at home began to change. Salaries were reduced or lost, businesses were forced to pause, expenses continued to pile up. That's why Latet has created a dedicated relief fund for families of reservists facing financial hardship because of the war. Over the next 6 months, Latet will provide monthly food and hygiene assistance to help families regain stability and return to everyday life. These families stood for all of us. Now it's our time to stand with them. Donate today.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Now, Jacob, the Washington, D.C. crowd is set to do the BOP, do the Board of Peace this week. And who are we expecting to be in this forum in the end? Last week, you and I discussed who may not be attending and also who may. So have there been any updates or changes since then?
Yeah, now we know Prime Minister Netanyahu will not be attending. I think that was the big question for some of his maybe Arab, some of his Arab counterparts in the region who were debating whether or not to come. I think there were some that I spoke with one Arab diplomat who said that if Netanyahu does not come, that we'll be more likely to see senior heads of state joining Trump in Washington, but that did not end up happening. It seems like the only leader from the region at the head of state level will be the King of Bahrain. The Prime Minister of Qatar will be there representing Qatar, but he's not the head of state there. The Emir is not going to be coming. Turkey's Erdogan won't be there. Egypt's President Sisi, Jordan's King Abdullah, none of these leaders will be attending. So I don't know if that's a complete dud, but I do think that's the Trump administration probably wanted some more senior people there. They are getting Viktor Orban of Hungary, and the leader of Indonesia will also be there. Indonesia, who's going to be contributing troops to the ISF. But for the most part, it's going to be simply senior, maybe foreign ministers like Gideon Sa'ar of Israel, who will be attending in Netanyahu's place. And the countries that I just mentioned, I think Jordan will be sending their foreign minister, Egypt will be sending their prime minister, but no real heads of state, other heads of state from the Middle East, which I think is probably the most important region in terms of this conflict. But Trump is talking about this being the Board of Peace that deals with lots of issues, not just Gaza. So maybe that will be the focus during the meeting on Thursday.
That's really interesting, Jacob. And I was thinking actually that maybe it's a good thing that these heads of state are not attending and maybe actually some, real work could get done. What is the sense in Washington? Is this meant to be a really, tachlis, a really get things done kind of meeting?
No, I don't think so. I think the meeting's supposed to take about an hour or two. That's according to the schedule. Trump already announced, I believe, on Sunday that there's going to be announcements on fundraising at this meeting. So he says that there'll be over $5 billion in funds pledged from several different countries for the reconstruction of Gaza. So it was able to confirm some of our reporting a couple of days earlier about we spoke about Qatar and the UAE and Kuwait, who will be among the countries who will be donating. Donations upwards of $1 billion each. And then you'll also actually have the United States, donating a similar amount, mainly going towards the humanitarian aid in Gaza, but also towards the ISF and longer term projects. But those are the countries I think you'll likely see making confirming those announcements on Thursday. Some pretty significant funding, and I think the U.S. is hoping that will encourage other countries to follow suit. But $5 billion, if we do see that, will definitely give enough space for the U.S. to move forward with this for at least a first phase of reconstruction in Gaza.
Right. $5 billion to me sounds like a whole heck of a lot of money. And it sounds like the meeting is already starting with what one could consider a success. So what else is on the table? And are, for example, the Palestinian technocrats meant to attend and voice their concerns?
So I would note on the issue of there's been similar fundraising conferences that took place before, even on Gaza, in previous wars, where lots of money was pledged and not all of it actually was given in the end. So I think that will be important to watch whether or not the funding is actually sent all the way to Gaza. I think the initial focus is going to be on the emergency humanitarian aid, and then moving towards more long-term projects, which the UAE will be involved in. But in terms of what else is on the agenda, I think there's going to be a push to talk more about disarmament, because that's, I think, the main issue that is holding a lot of these countries back from giving money, is that they want to see that Hamas will actually be disarmed. I think the U.S. is working on a resolution to have bring forward to the Board of Peace to sign and get behind, in order to then present it to have the mediators present it to Hamas. But my understanding is that it's not necessarily going to be announced at this conference, that the focus will be more on fundraising. But I think that will be definitely discussed, even if there's going to be the other boards that will be meeting as well, that are below the Board of Peace. So like the Executive Board and the Gaza Executive Board. I think those officials will be discussing the issue of disarmament with more substance.
Right. And at the same time, of course, in Israel, Israel is giving some kind of deadline to Hamas to disarm before a renewed ground operation in Gaza. Jacob, do you know anything about this that you can share?
Yeah, one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's aides, Yossi Fuchs, mentioned at a conference on Monday that Israel is giving Hamas 60 days to disarm. It'll be interesting to see if that 60 days is from the Board of Peace meeting, if that clock starts at a different time or it already started. I think ultimately it'll be President Trump's decision. I don't think Israel is going to resume major military operations in Gaza without an okay from Trump. On the other hand, we've seen pretty intensive fighting since the ceasefire. In many ways, there's been pretty regular strikes that we've seen in Gaza, and it's possible that I think that's been maybe that normalizes the situation for Trump, that he'll be okay with it continuing at a slightly larger scale. I don't think Israel's talking about the massive amounts of call-ups of reservists that it did during the war, that this would be something a little bit smaller and maybe focused starting on Gaza City. But I think that the Israeli hope, and I think the assumption, is that this doesn't work, this whole Board of Peace effort, and that therefore then we can resume the war and maybe achieve this total victory that we weren't able to achieve in the first 2 years.
Maybe put that to the side, but at the same time, we're hearing voices from the Board of Peace that the continued strikes are definitely causing the Palestinian technocrats, at least, not to be effective in their role. So what are you hearing? Very direct, strong quotes from the former UN envoy to Israel.
Yeah, Nikolai Mladenov, who's the Board of Peace's Gaza High Representative, basically the probably the most important figure outside of the U.S. in terms of the post-war management of Gaza, and he's going to be overseeing the committee of technocrats, this NCAG, National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. And he said in a panel discussion at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend that the main issue preventing the NCAG from returning to Gaza or entering Gaza for the first time is these violations of the ceasefire. Now, I'll note that he didn't say who's violating the ceasefire, because Israel says it's definitely Hamas that's leading to the strikes, and Hamas, of course, says that these are Israeli violations, every single one of them. But he just says the general situation in Gaza right now, if we just send the NCAG back in, we're ensuring that they're going to fail, because they're not going to be able to stop what's this current dynamic. And we want the situation to calm down more before we actually send them back in, so that they're set up for more success.
Right. So the disarmament of Hamas is key to this, of course. And as you said, it will be on the table, but perhaps no formal resolution will be pushed through on Thursday. But are you hearing more fingers pointing, I guess you're seeing more fingers pointing at Israel or at Hamas from where you stand, both in Washington and in the U.S. in general, Jacob?
I think there's a recognition that Hamas is playing spoiler, but I also think that the feeling, at least amongst, I think, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere amongst the mediators, is that the Israeli strikes and retaliation are going too far, and therefore not allowing for the things to calm down a little bit more, given that this has just been happening on a daily basis. I think what will be interesting to see also is that Ali Shah, the head of the NCAG, will be attending, my understanding is this Board of Peace conference, and I think the way he presents it will be important. I think he's being kept on a tight leash from the Americans and the other mediators. He has not done a lot of media engagement since being named last month. But I think if he comes forward and makes certain statements regarding be it Hamas or Israel, I think that would carry some weight as well.
Okay, so please check out the live blog on Thursday for more updates. Now, to end with, Jacob, I want to talk about U.S. President Donald Trump's attacks on my president, Israeli President Isaac Herzog. And this comes with the backdrop of Trump repeatedly pushing Herzog to give Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu a pardon for the various criminal cases he's involved in. So, Jacob, this newest I don't know, I would call it an attack on Herzog. Was it actually prompted by anything, or did it kind of come out of the blue?
So that's the question. It came right after Prime Minister Netanyahu's meeting with President Trump at the White House. So the assumption straight after, when President Trump says, I think he was speaking to reporters, he wasn't blanket asked about the pardon. I think he was just asked whether or not he thinks Netanyahu is responsible for October 7th. And Trump continues to defend him and saying, actually, any other prime minister wouldn't have been able to be as successful as Prime Minister Netanyahu. But then he goes on to the pardon and says that, well, President Herzog should be ashamed of himself for not giving him a pardon. So I think the assumption was that maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu said something during the meeting, but we did have Netanyahu's office issue a denial saying, no, that was not the case. That's the way they're framing it right now. But I think it takes us back to one of the earlier meetings, I think at the end of December, when President Trump was meeting with Netanyahu at Mar-a-Lago, and he was asked more directly about the pardon, and President Trump said he spoke with Herzog and the pardon is on its way. That was how Trump understood things at the time. President Herzog was quick to say, no, what are you talking about? We never spoke. My people from your orbit did reach out to me and in my office, and we tried to explain to them how the pardon process works, and that actually it's not just something that I can just decide to do on a whim, that there's a process, and that actually in the most recent statement Herzog put out, he explained that there needs to be a Justice Ministry legal opinion before a recommendation from the Justice Ministry before Herzog can make a decision, and that part of the process is still ongoing, that he hasn't gotten that Justice Ministry legal opinion yet, and that's why he hasn't made his decision. I think that's I don't know if it's an excuse, but it's been several months since the pardon was submitted by Netanyahu, or the pardon request. I think Herzog is probably just uncomfortable with the situation right now, especially coming under pressure from a U.S. president. But I guess in Trump's mind, they spoke about it several months ago, so therefore it needs to be Herzog needs to make a decision, and the fact that he hasn't means that Trump is going to lash out at him. I think. It doesn't seem like, I think it just continues to make it less and less likely. The fact that Israel wants to present itself as a sovereign country that isn't taking orders from the U.S. president. Add that to the fact that Netanyahu isn't willing to admit any sort of guilt, which I think is something that a lot of legal scholars say is necessary. Add to the fact that the trial's still ongoing, and typically that you don't issue a pardon until that's over. So I don't think Trump is necessarily helping the case, but I don't know at this point if that's really the goal. If President Trump wants to be seen as helping Netanyahu, at least at this current stage, I guess that's what he'll continue to do.
I thought personally that Herzog's response was really a stroke of brilliance, because if he's throwing the ball back at the Justice Ministry, and of course a huge Netanyahu loyalist is heading that ministry, it was just such a perfect response. Like, no, it's not me. It is Netanyahu loyalist Yariv Levin who is holding everything up. Really a great response. Okay, Jacob, thank you so much for staying up late and speaking with me yet again.
My pleasure, Amanda. Good to be with you again.
Always my pleasure. Thanks so much for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by Ari Schlacht. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.